welcome back to the examination series. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the exam generally for Orthopaedic Fellowship in terms of the how it's run, who it's run by, and the role of some of those people running your exam. And we hope you learn something from this to get a bit of an idea about the backstory for the exam and what's happening behind the scenes. So Rick, could you tell me what is the process and the hierarchy of the Court of Examiners? Where do you sit? Who are you governed by? Is it the AOA? Is it the college? Who runs our exam?
So the principle of the exam is that the assessment shouldn't be done by the trainers. And so the exam is completely under the auspices of the College of Surgeons. In orthopaedics, the training is essentially subcontracted to the AOA, who do a fantastic job in the training. And it's a little bit artificial in that most members of I think all members of the Court of Examiners are AOA members, but they're not part of the governance hierarchy necessarily in the AOA. So the College of Surgeons run the exam. There are 9 subspecialties through the college who are examined at each exam, and orthopaedics is the second largest of those subspecialties. The Court of Examiners itself sits underneath the Board of Education, and the Board of Education sit underneath the Council of the College. So we have a counsellor who is an ex-examiner who is appointed as the chairman of the Court of Examiners, and that covers all 9 subspecialties. And then the executive of the Court of Examiners is the current senior examiner, the incoming examiner, a senior examiner in some subspecialties, and then there's a deputy chair from New Zealand and a deputy chair from Australia who make up the high table of the Court of Examiners with the chairman, and we report to the Education Board and through them to the council.
You've just recently finished a senior role as a chief examiner. What did that involve, and who are you looking after, and what was that role?
Yeah, so
like?
Senior examiner to a certain extent is everybody else takes one step back, but the examining court in orthopaedics is essentially broken up into blocks of 3 years. So if you're appointed as an examiner, you're on for 9 years. The first 3 years you're really learning, and you're always paired with a much more senior person who's been on for a lot longer. And in the middle 3 years we often pair people who are about that same level, who are very, very experienced by that stage, together. So by the time you're in your 7th, 8th and 9th year as an examiner, you're often teaching the new examiners where the standard is, how the questions flow, how to get the best out of candidates. And then after that time, I was honoured to then be put in as the senior examiner. And the senior examiner's role is largely administrative. So unless there's a real problem, the senior examiner doesn't physically examine. They can step in if there's a conflict, they can step in if there's a real immediate issue on the day. But most of their role is coordinating, collating, troubleshooting for the exam, and that flexibility we talked about before, really being, I guess, the go-to, and interminable numbers of meetings and liaising with the college and the AOA and pretty much everybody. We don't want it to go on too long, but there's lots of musings that most examiners come up with by the end. The first thing I'd say about the exam is that it is, when I first observed the exam, I came away thinking it is the fairest process that I'd ever seen. That somebody the examiners work very hard to get the best out of the candidates, to try and get them over the line. It is an exit exam. People have had their training. We would expect that most people would be at a point where they would pass this exam. That doesn't mean you will pass the exam, because anything can happen on the day, and that's always the hard part for candidates to get their head around, is that you can be very well prepared and just not make it on the day. I think it's very much less likely that you can be underprepared and just manage to fluke it through. But so preparation is everything, and that doesn't. It helps you on the day to be a bit less stressed, but you know, you need to be prepared that on the day you turn up for the exam, even the most prepared candidate is going to be extraordinarily stressed, probably more stressed than you've ever been in your life. And it's a different stress to being in theatre and, you know, all the other things that you do.
Does the AOA tell you what to examine us on, or how do you link the two bodies together?
So the examination is sourced from and dependent on the curriculum for orthopaedics. The curriculum is one of the real jewels in the crown of AOA 21. So the AOA revamped training a number of years ago, and all of the people who are currently sitting, I think with very few exceptions, are now AOA 21 trainees. And one of the really important and impressive pieces of work that went with that was the redrafting of the curriculum. And if you haven't read the curriculum, or at least have an acquaintance with how it's formatted, I'd encourage you to download a copy and read that. But so the exam, all exam questions are blueprinted against the curriculum. Some areas are examinable as discussion points, some areas are examinable as you need to be competent in that skill set, and we don't deviate from that as far as the curriculum is concerned. So yeah, the AOA produce the training and the requirements, and then the Court of Examiners put together the exam every February and examine to that curriculum and blueprint against that.
Okay, and you say put the exam together in February. There are 2 exams, aren't there, each year?
Yeah, so February each year, with a lot of work up beforehand. The Court of Examiners get together. The last year we've had to do that virtually, which was interesting, but usually we get together as a group and we look at each segment of the exam. We have a smaller group that works on that segment of the exam and makes however many questions we need for, well, it's 3 exams every year, so one in Australia and one in New Zealand in May, one in Australia in September, and then we I guess road test each of those questions at that weekend retreat, so that by the end of that in February we've essentially got an exam drafted. Then there's a lot of work that goes on about proofreading the questions and blueprinting against the curriculum and making sure that, you know, we've covered the scope of orthopaedics, and usually by about the end of February we've got the exams prepared. We then, before each exam, the examiners who are going to be examining in that particular exam get together and go through all the questions again to make sure that they're standardised, that each pair of examiners are going to ask the same flow of questions, that each question is well known to the examiners, because obviously not every question is in that specific examiner's subspecialty. So there's quite a lot of work the examiners do to try and bring themselves up to speed to understand the questions and understand where the questions are going.
And Rick, if the exam is set in February, that's it for the whole year then, is that correct? So the following 2 or 3 exams, 1 in New Zealand, 2 in Australia, that's done, set in stone?
Yeah, if COVID's taught us one thing, it's to be flexible. So when we had, so for example 2020, when we went from 2 exams to 1 exam, and the 1 exam happened in October, we actually did have to revamp the questions in the exam, re-blueprint, redo everything, but we still then had some worked up questions that we could then re-workshop in February and put into the exams for 2021.
Okay.
So there's a degree of flexibility in the process of the exam, and I'm sure everybody knows about how we broke up into hubs and how we managed to get the exams on for the last 2 years. But the actual questions don't change. So the thrust of the questions, you know, particularly things like essays, they have been discussed many, many times. There's a sort of a model answer that pulls out the salient points of the responses that we're looking for. So those things can't change at short notice.
And I've heard of people trying to find out who's examining them and research them and know what their subspecialties are. Is that a worthwhile thing doing?
Absolutely not. you usually know the examiners from your own state, so you know those people anyway. But if you think that you can influence your performance in the exam by performing to the examiner in front of you, you need to just reset, because the examiners are not examining in their subspecialty, they're examining to a standardised set of questions, and it's a pointless exercise to try and double guess who's actually examining you. If a candidate feels that they have a particular conflict of interest with an examiner, that examiner might have sat on a disciplinary board, they may have had a problem when they were working in a particular unit, or a positive conflict of interest where they feel that they may be joining that examiner's practice when they finish the exam, that they can declare a conflict of interest. And by declaring a conflict of interest, you essentially say, I don't think that it would be fair either for the examiner or myself to be examined by that individual. And the college are very respectful of that and will work the timetable around that. We do a lot of dealing with conflicts of interest leading into exams.
Rick, could you explain to me, just because it seems random as an outsider, where the exam's going to be held and when, in terms of which part of the country and what time?
So the timetabling for the exam is actually made it's worked out 2 years ahead, and it has to accommodate the 9 subspecialties that the college examine, in terms of giving them some certainty where the exam is going to be held, and a lot of the preparations are very important. It's a big event for the city that's holding it. So it rotates through, for the New Zealand exam in May, it rotates through 3 centres. I think Christchurch is back online, but we've been using Wellington and Auckland since the earthquake in Christchurch. In Australia, in May, it alternates between Melbourne and Brisbane. And then in September, it alternates between Sydney and Adelaide. And all of that is based really on the capacity of those centres to hold exams for large numbers of people. You know, the May exam in Australia can be anything up to about, I think the big one that we've just done was about 68 candidates or thereabouts. So there's a lot of infrastructure that's required with that. We talked about flexibility within the exam process. With COVID, we had to actually completely redesign how to do exams and go into hubs, so that we could, essentially have self-contained units that if one of them was affected by COVID, we could still run the exam for the majority of people in the country.
And is the plan to move back to a centralised process? Is that the preference?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the examiners find it much more representative. We feel very much that the exams that were produced in 2020 and 2021 were of exactly the same standard, that the assessment was unaffected, but we worked really hard to achieve that. Mm-hmm. But the preference very much is for having it in a centre to centralise resources. It means we can be much more adaptable with pairings of the examiners. It means that the candidates are not necessarily worried about being examined by people that they may have worked for, that they know really well. And there's certainly a sense that if you're being examined by 2 people that you know really well, you don't want to disappoint them, and you might end up changing how you answer things, and your performance might change because of that. So we're very aware of that, and we don't want that to be a factor.
And in terms of how that fits in terms of who the exam's run for, at the moment it's run for people who are in the core stage of training in the new AOA 21 system, and that means that you could have anyone from their 3rd or to their 5th or longer years sitting the exam, depending on the pathway that they've chosen to do their training. How has that been as an examiner, seeing, I guess, a mix of year levels and different people coming through and sitting the exam?
It's interesting. It's a bit early to tell. We've only had 2 exams so far that have been predominantly AOA 21 trainees, and one was the transition group. If you're prepared to sit the exam, then I don't think it really matters. We've always had some candidates who sit a bit early. They might sit in, in the old days when we had set trainees, they might have sat in the second half of their fourth year, whereas the traditional thing was in the first half of your fifth year. The problem that I see with training at the moment, not a big problem, but people conceive training still to be, you've got some surgeons who still conceive it to be the old 4-year training, you've got some surgeons who conceive it to be 5 years of training, you've got now the AOA 21 where we talk about intro and core and transition, and I think most people still break it down into how many years have you been on the training program, and as most candidates will know, that doesn't necessarily take in how many years did you do as an unaccredited beforehand. So the level of experience and the amount of that people have seen has always been quite variable.
Yep. I'd be really keen to hear your insights into the exam as a whole, preparing for it, the different parts of the exam, what you're looking for when you, as an examiner in each section. So let's get into the juice of it and work through that.